Emily Carter stood before the gleaming doors of the Viking Fight Academy, the late afternoon sun casting a golden hue across the building's glass facade. She took a deep breath, allowing the warmth to settle in her chest before stepping inside. The academy, renowned for its fierce reputation and its champion-producing legacy, was about to be her battleground, not just for skill, but for something much more personal. At 34, Emily didn't look like the typical new student, young, eager, and brimming with ambition. Her brown belt, worn with years of dedication and quiet mastery, was hidden beneath a well-worn GI, a symbol of her experience. But today, she wasn't here to flaunt her skills. She was here to challenge a culture that had been breeding toxicity for years, especially when it came to women in jiu-jitsu. "Here goes," she muttered under her breath, the familiar weight of her gym bag pulling her forward. The memory of her grandfather's voice, gentle but resolute, whispered in her mind. "Change the way they see us, Emily. Keep the spirit of jiu-jitsu alive." His passing 3 months ago had left a hollow ache in her heart, but his words were a constant beacon guiding her every step. Emily had spent the better part of her life training under her grandfather's watchful eye. Black belt himself, he was known for his unorthodox approach, focusing not just on technique but on fostering respect, humility, and strength of character. He'd always said, "Jiu-jitsu is about growth, not ego." But the world of competitive jiu-jitsu had strayed from that, and it was time to bring it back. The Viking Fight Academy was notorious for its aggressive approach. Its head coach, Victor Johansson, had earned a reputation for turning students into champions through sheer force and intense training methods. His social media accounts were filled with videos of grueling sparring sessions, many crossing the line into hazing. Emily had heard the rumors. The academy had no place for women who weren't competing at the highest level, and that's where she would prove them wrong. Walking into the front lobby, Emily was immediately hit by the smell of sweat, the sound of grunting, and the fierce energy of bodies colliding with the mat. The academy's walls were lined with medals and photos of champions, reminding her of the pressure this place exuded. She wasn't just stepping into a gym, she was stepping into a battlefield. She approached the front desk where a young man sat, absorbed in his phone. Emily cleared her throat, but he didn't look up. "I'm here for the advanced class," she said, her voice steady but neutral. "I just moved to the area." The receptionist barely glanced at her, his skepticism almost palpable. "Advanced class is for brown or black belts only," he muttered, eyeing her worn guy. "You sure you belong here?" Emily didn't flinch. "Brown belt," she replied evenly. 15 years of training." His eyes flicked to her belt, and then back to his phone. After a long moment, he shrugged, nodding toward a clipboard. "Sign in, locker rooms are through there. Class starts in 10. As Emily signed the waiver, she felt the weight of the moment settle in. This wasn't just about proving her skills. It was about exposing the culture that had pervaded this academy for so long. The toxic masculinity that had kept women like her on the sidelines. Today, she was here to change that. The locker room was quiet, save for a few women getting ready for class. As Emily undressed and changed into her gi, she noticed their eyes on her. They weren't welcoming glances, more like ones filled with silent judgment. She could already feel the tension in the air. Women who had to work twice as hard to earn their place, only to be overlooked or ignored by the men in the gym. A tall woman with a purple belt approached her. "I'm Dina," she said with a tight smile. "Just a heads up. Victor doesn't think much of female practitioners above blue belt unless you've competed at a national level. You might want to be prepared for that." Emily nodded, keeping her expression neutral despite the anger rising within her. She had heard enough of this. "Thanks for the warning." Dina gave her a knowing look before turning away to finish tying her hair. Emily took a moment to adjust her brown belt, glancing at a photo of her grandfather tucked into her wallet. His face smiled back at her, a silent reminder of why she was here. The sounds of the gym grew louder as the class began. Emily stepped onto the mats and the atmosphere shifted. The advanced class was filled with mostly men, each one eyeing her with varying degrees of skepticism. Their glares and whispers were impossible to ignore. At the center of the room stood Victor Johansson, his tall frame exuding authority. He was in his early 40s, with a chiseled physique and the confidence of someone accustomed to dominance. As he saw Emily approach, he raised an eyebrow and smirked. "Well, what do we have here?" Victor's voice boomed, catching the attention of the entire class. "Ladies' self-defense class is on Thursday, sweetheart." A few of the students chuckled. Emily, undeterred, bowed respectfully as she stepped onto the mat. "I'm here for the advanced class, brown belt. 15 years of training," she said, her voice calm but firm. Victor's smirk widened. "Is that so? Well, let's see what you've got then." He gestured for the students to line up by rank, and Emily took her place among the brown belts. They were all larger than her, some by as much as 30 pounds. She could feel their eyes on her, sizing her up, dismissing her before she had even done anything. As Victor called for a demonstration, his eyes landed on Emily with deliberate slowness. "Our new friend can help me with the demonstration," he announced, clearly enjoying the challenge he had set. Emily stepped forward, keeping her expression neutral. This wasn't just about the demonstration. It was the beginning of her plan, to expose the toxicity in this environment, one step at a time. The room fell silent as Victor Johansson stepped onto the mat, his gaze fixed firmly on Emily. She could feel the weight of his eyes on her as the other students watched intently. This wasn't just a training session. It felt like a test, a performance for Victor's amusement. Emily steadied her breath, reminding herself that today wasn't about winning, but about showing what Jiu-Jitsu truly stood for. "Let's start with a basic demonstration," Victor said, a hint of mockery lacing his words. "We'll do some drills, show everyone what a brown belt can do. After all, it's important to understand where you stand in the food chain here." Emily didn't flinch at his tone. This was a challenge, but it was nothing she hadn't faced before. She had dealt with disrespect before, especially being a woman in a male-dominated sport. But she wasn't here for them to respect her. She was here to show them the flaws in their thinking. Victor started the demonstration by showing a basic triangle submission. He called a pair of students to the center of the mat to perform the technique, and Emily was asked to observe. His voice was steady, instructing the students with the air of someone who had all the answers. "See, you control the position with your legs," Victor explained, demonstrating the move with an almost casual arrogance. "It's about dominance, pressure, making sure your opponent has nowhere to go." Emily watched closely, noting the technical aspects of the move. As Victor demonstrated, she could tell that his focus wasn't entirely on the art of jiu-jitsu. There was a heavy emphasis on strength and control, not flow or the finer points of technique. The difference between what he was teaching and what her grandfather had instilled in her was glaring. "Now, let's see how Emily does," Victor called, his eyes scanning the room, already dismissing her as just another newcomer to be tested. Emily stepped forward, feeling the eyes of every student on her. The mat beneath her feet felt solid, grounding her as she squared up to Victor. It was time to show them that jiu-jitsu wasn't about size, strength, or ego. It was about control, respect, and technique. She bowed slightly, maintaining the courtesy that her grandfather had taught her. Victor smiled, his confidence unwavering. "Let's see if you can handle a real challenge. Show me your triangle escape." Without waiting for her to respond, Victor shot in for a quick takedown. Emily allowed him to take her down with ease, maintaining a controlled fall. She kept her calm, not reacting to his forceful moves. His intentions were clear. This wasn't just about training. This was a test of her resilience. "Get out of this," Victor said, positioning himself into side control, a position where he could apply maximum pressure. Emily knew exactly what to do. She shifted her weight subtly, using his momentum against him. Her arms moved with fluid precision, executing a technical escape that her grandfather had taught her. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't designed to show off. It was efficient. Victor immediately recognized her technique. A slight frown tugged at his lips as Emily moved smoothly out of his hold. For a moment, the gym went silent, the students watching, with curious eyes. Emily had shown her skill, and it was undeniable. But Victor wasn't finished yet. "Lucky move," Victor muttered under his breath, straightening up. He didn't hide his disdain, but the brief flicker of recognition in his eyes didn't go unnoticed by Emily. He had underestimated her, and now she had his attention. For the next 10 minutes, Victor continued to increase the intensity of the drills, pushing Emily to demonstrate more advanced techniques. She responded with each move, always one step ahead, keeping her true abilities restrained. She could have taken him down in seconds, but that wasn't the point. She had to show them that it wasn't about raw power or aggression, it was about control and technique. After the drills, Victor stepped back, his arms crossed, studying Emily with a sharper gaze. "This is what's wrong with Jiu-Jitsu today," he said, his voice loud enough for the entire class to hear. "People like her, walking around with belts they haven't earned. This isn't about self-improvement, it's about fighting to win." The gym fell into a hush, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Emily felt her pulse quicken, but she didn't rise to his provocation. She knew the real test was yet to come. Victor's gaze never left her. "You don't belong here," he added, his voice cutting through the stillness. "Women like you should stick to yoga." Emily's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. His words were cruel, but they didn't sting like they used to. She had spent years proving herself in environments like this, where people doubted her abilities because of her gender. But this time it was different. She wasn't here to prove anything to Victor. She was here to expose the flaws in his approach and in the system he represented. The class began to pair off for sparring. Victor's eyes scanned the room, and for the first time they lingered on Emily with something other than disdain. He wasn't just testing her technique anymore. He was testing her will. "Collins, take a break," Victor called out to Emily. "You look tired." It was an obvious dismissal, a move to remind her that she was still an outsider in his eyes. But Emily didn't move. She stayed on the mat, watching the others pair off, knowing that this was just the beginning of what she had to do. Her eyes met Sarah's across the room. Sarah, the only person who knew what Emily was truly capable of, gave her a small nod. The camera was rolling. This wasn't just about a fight on the mat. It was about a fight for respect, for change. Emily took a deep breath. The real challenge hadn't even begun yet, but she was ready. The gym was alive with movement as Victor Johansson's voice rang out, commanding his students to begin sparring. Emily stayed at the edge of the mat, watching intently as the energy of the room grew. She was more than prepared, but she needed to stay patient. Today, she wasn't just proving her strength. She was exposing the flaws in this gym's culture. "Collins," Victor's voice cut through her thoughts, drawing her attention back to the mat. "You're up next." Emily squared up to Jason, a confident black belt. His expression was one of casual superiority. "I'll take it easy on you," he said with a smirk, clearly thinking this would be a walk in the park. They began in closed guard, and Jason immediately pushed forward, trying to control her. But Emily moved with precision, using his weight against him and subtly shifting to avoid being trapped. The more pressure he applied, the more Emily adjusted, always keeping her movements calculated and efficient. Victor, watching from the side, barked, "More pressure, Jason." Let her feel the real intensity of the fight. Jason complied, but his actions grew more desperate as he couldn't seem to get the upper hand. Emily felt the subtle tension building. Victor was testing her patience, pushing her to make a mistake. But Emily didn't take the bait. She kept her cool and used her technique to neutralize Jason's strength, making him frustrated. After a few minutes, Victor walked over. "You're still not showing the aggression you need," he said, his voice condescending. He grabbed Emily's arm and repositioned it, forcefully trying to demonstrate his version of the move. "Thank you, sir," Emily said quietly, allowing him to do so, but she kept her technique intact. As soon as he let go, she adjusted, moving out of the position smoothly. "You're lucky," Victor muttered, clearly irritated. "But don't think this is enough. You're not here to just survive. You're here to win." The tension in the room was palpable. Victor's attempts to break her down had failed, and he wasn't happy about it. Emily knew that this wasn't just about skill. It was about him wanting to dominate, wanting to show that he was in control. As the round ended, Victor called for a break, his voice sharp. Emily remained still, wiping her brow, but her mind was focused. She had passed his test, for now, but the real challenge, the fight for respect, was still to come. Victor paced back and forth before addressing the class. "We'll do a round robin. Now, 30-second rounds. Collins, you're up first with me." The room fell silent. The students all turned to look at her, clearly surprised. Victor never sparred with newcomers, especially not in such a public way. Emily stepped onto the mat, her nerves steady. She had prepared for this moment. It wasn't just about showing skill. It was about showing them all that Jiu-Jitsu was about more than power. It was about control, respect, and technique. She faced Victor, ready to take the challenge. This was where everything changed. Emily stood across from Victor Johansson on the mat, her heart steady and focused. She had been here before, facing opponents who underestimated her, doubted her abilities. But this was different. This was Victor, the man who ruled this gym, the man who had built his reputation on dominance. She wasn't just going to prove herself to him. She was going to show him that true strength came from more than just physical power. Victor grinned, his posture relaxed, almost taunting. "You're sure you're ready for this, Collins?" he sneered. "This is where the real test begins." He lunged at her with surprising speed, aiming to take her down. Emily felt the shift in his movements, the way he expected her to react, with force, to fight back with brute strength. But that wasn't her game. She shifted her weight, letting him come to her, using his aggression against him. Victor's eyes widened for a brief moment as he realized she wasn't giving him the satisfaction of a struggle. "Impressive," he muttered under his breath, but there was no admiration in his voice, only a sense of annoyance. He quickly adjusted, trying to overpower her once again, but Emily was ready. She slipped out of his grasp, turning her body in a smooth, fluid motion. The room was quiet now, the other students watching with rapt attention. They had seen Victor dominate countless opponents, but this time he was struggling. His confidence was slipping, and it didn't take long for Emily to see the first signs of frustration. "You're just delaying the inevitable," Victor growled, attempting a submission. He tried to move into a more dominant position, but Emily was too quick. She escaped with ease, twisting and adjusting her body with precision. For the next few minutes, Victor pushed harder, trying to force her into uncomfortable positions. He was beginning to take risks, increasing the intensity of his attacks. But each time he attempted to assert his control, Emily responded with technical expertise, always one step ahead. She wasn't showing off. She was simply doing what she had been taught, using leverage, maintaining control, and outmaneuvering her opponent. But Victor wasn't finished. He attempted a Kimura grip, a submission that could cause serious harm, if applied incorrectly. Emily felt the pressure on her shoulder, but her instincts kicked in. She could feel the tension, the risk of injury, but she also knew it wasn't about brute strength. It was about maintaining her composure and waiting for the right moment. "Tap," Victor barked, his voice growing more impatient. He cranked the submission, pushing his weight down on her. Emily could feel the strain, the pain creeping in, but she wasn't going to tap. Not yet. Not until she had proven her point. Her grandfather's words echoed in her mind. "Jiu-Jitsu is about leverage, Emily. It's about technique, not power. Always remember that." With a subtle shift in her hips, Emily released some of the pressure, turning the tables on Victor. The move was smooth, almost effortless as she slipped out of his grasp. Victor, caught off guard, stumbled slightly. In that instant, Emily transitioned quickly, using his momentum against him. She locked his arm in a perfect armbar, her legs, securing his position, her hips raised just enough to create the leverage she needed. Victor froze, his expression changing from frustration to disbelief. His eyes widened as he realized he was caught. The gym fell silent, the other students watching in stunned silence. Emily maintained the hold, applying just enough pressure to make Victor feel the weight of his arrogance. For a moment, time seemed to slow. Victor struggled, his pride fighting against the technique that had just rendered him immobile. He tried to pull his arm free, but Emily's grip was unyielding. He let out a sharp breath, a sign of surrender, though his pride wouldn't allow him to tap immediately. The tension in the room was unbearable, and for the first time that day, Victor's voice faltered. "What the hell?" he began, but his words trailed off as he finally accepted the defeat. "Tap," Emily said softly, her voice calm, her composure unshaken. "It's okay to tap, Victor." The room remained silent as Victor finally slapped the mat in submission, the sound echoing through the gym. Emily immediately released the hold, rolling away gracefully and returning to a kneeling position. She bowed respectfully, just as she had been taught. Despite the way Victor had treated her, she maintained the tradition, the respect that Jiu-Jitsu was built on. Victor, however, didn't return the gesture. His face was flushed with humiliation and anger as he pushed himself up, adjusting his gi. There was no acknowledgement of her skill, only an attempt to save face. "Lucky move," he muttered, though no one believed him. His eyes darted around the room, clearly trying to regain his authority. The students, who had been silent throughout the entire exchange, began to murmur among themselves. Emily could feel their gazes on her, not with skepticism or condescension anymore, but with something else: respect. She had done what they had all thought impossible. She had shown Victor Johansson that skill, not power, was what truly mattered in Jiu-Jitsu. As Victor moved to regain control of the class, he dismissed Emily with a curt wave. "Enough," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "Let's get back to training." But Emily knew what had just happened. Victor's facade had cracked, and she had exposed the core of the toxic culture that had been allowed to thrive in this gym. She wasn't just a brown belt. She was a testament to what Jiu-Jitsu truly stood for. As she walked off the mat, Sarah caught her eye from the corner of the room. The camera had captured everything. The evidence was clear. Emily had won more than just a fight. She had made a statement. The real work was just beginning. The tension in the gym lingered long after the sparring session ended. The murmurs of the students, once filled with skepticism and dismissal, had shifted to a quieter, more thoughtful tone. Emily knew that her victory over Victor Johansson, the revered head coach, would not be easily forgotten. It wasn't just about proving herself. It was about exposing the very culture that had allowed men like him to dominate, unchecked and unquestioned. As the class continued, Victor's earlier arrogance had evaporated. He seemed distracted, moving through the drills with less of his usual flair. His commands, once sharp and commanding, had softened, as if the walls he had so carefully built were beginning to crack. Emily watched from the sidelines, knowing that today's events had already begun to change the atmosphere in this gym. The students were beginning to question what they had always been told, what they had always been taught. That strength came from dominance, from crushing your opponent, from asserting control. But Jiu-Jitsu wasn't about that. It never had been. After the session wrapped up, Victor called for a quick huddle. He seemed to regain some semblance of his usual self, but the unease in his eyes didn't go unnoticed. He was trying to hold on to his authority, but there was a crack in his foundation now. Emily could see it. The class gathered around him, and Victor looked at them, his face a mixture of frustration and forced confidence. "We need to focus on refining our techniques," Victor said, his voice still firm but tinged with something less convincing. Today's sparring was unorthodox, but I'll give Collins credit. Her technique was solid. Emily didn't react. She had already learned that her actions spoke louder than words. Her goal wasn't to seek approval from Victor or anyone else here. She had already proven what needed to be proven. Now, Victor continued, his eyes briefly meeting hers. "We'll work on submissions and escapes. Jason, you're with Collins." Jason, the black belt from earlier, shot Emily a glance. There was no longer any condescension in his eyes, only quiet respect. He nodded, a silent agreement to the challenge she had presented. He hadn't expected to lose, but now he understood. This wasn't just about fighting. It was about respect. The students broke into pairs and Emily went to work with Jason on the drills. She was careful, still holding back enough to keep the focus on the technique, not brute force. They practiced transitions and escapes, Emily guiding Jason through the motions as they flowed seamlessly from one move to the next. Halfway through the drills, Emily caught Victor watching them from across the mat. His expression had softened slightly, but there was still a wariness in his eyes. He was beginning to see what he had missed before. That true mastery of Jiu-Jitsu wasn't about overpowering someone physically, but about understanding the flow of movement, about knowing when to use power and when to use technique. As the session wrapped up, Victor called for another break. Emily, feeling the weight of the day's events, stepped off the mat, grabbing her water bottle. She took a deep breath, her thoughts turning inward. The battle here was far from over. She had exposed the flaws in Victor's training style, but the culture of the gym was still entrenched. She needed to do more than just prove herself. She needed to help change the mindset of everyone in this room. "Collins, stay behind," Victor called as the others began to gather their things. Emily's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she had a feeling this conversation would be different from the usual dismissals. She walked over to him, her posture straight but calm. Victor waited until the last of the students had left the gym before speaking. "You've got skill," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "And I've underestimated you. I won't deny that. But you've also made a mess of things here. You've shaken the foundation of this academy." Emily nodded, her gaze steady. Maybe it needed shaking. Victor didn't respond right away. He looked at her, his gaze searching. Finally, he spoke, his tone softer, almost begrudging. "I don't know what it is you're trying to do here, Collins, but you've got my attention. You've shown me something I haven't seen before." He paused, then added, "Maybe it's time we rethink things around here." Emily's heart swelled with a quiet sense of accomplishment. She wasn't here to break Victor, but to show him that there was another way, a better way, and now he was beginning to see it. "I'm not trying to break anything," Emily said, her voice calm and resolute. "I'm just trying to help rebuild." Victor regarded her for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Rebuild," he repeated quietly. "Maybe you're right. Maybe it's time for a change." As Emily left the gym that evening, she couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet, triumph. This was just the beginning. There was more work to be done, more minds to change, more hearts to open. But for the first time, she felt like she was truly starting to make a difference. And Victor Johansson, the man who had built this academy, on power and dominance, had just begun to realize that true strength came from something much deeper. The next few days passed in a blur for Emily. The gym felt different, charged with a new energy that hadn't been there before. Victor's usual domineering presence had softened. He still carried himself with authority, but there was a hesitation. Now, a wariness when it came to his treatment of the students. Emily's win over him, her calmness in the face of his aggression, had struck a chord deeper than anyone, including Victor, had expected. But change, as Emily knew well, was never quick or easy. Each training session that followed was a mixture of progress and resistance. Victor made subtle changes to the way he instructed, easing up on the harshness in his approach. However, it was clear he was struggling with how far he should go. The old habits didn't vanish overnight. His expectations were still set high, but there was a noticeable shift. He was now focusing more on technical precision than sheer aggression. Emily noticed it, and so did the other students. There was a change in the way they interacted with her. The skepticism was still there, buried beneath layers of doubt, but the looks had softened. Now, they were more curious than dismissive, and some even seemed willing to listen, willing to learn. The gym, for the first time, was becoming a space of genuine learning, rather than a battleground for egos. One afternoon, as Emily was preparing for a drill with a new partner, she was called over by Dina, the tall woman with the purple belt who had warned her about Victor's attitudes toward female practitioners. Dina had been one of the skeptics watching Emily's sparring match with Victor from the sidelines, her expression unreadable. But now she approached Emily with a different look in her eyes, one of cautious curiosity. "You're doing something here, aren't you?" Dina said, her voice low as she stood beside Emily. Emily smiled slightly, tightening her GI. "I'm just doing jiu-jitsu." Dina didn't seem convinced. "You're not just doing jiu-jitsu, Emily. You're making people rethink what it means to be good at it. Victor's not the only one who's changing." Emily met her gaze. "I'm not here to change anyone. I'm here to help them see what jiu-jitsu really is." Dina nodded slowly. "I get it now. I thought you were just another girl trying to prove herself. But you're not like the others." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "You're making them uncomfortable, and I'm starting to think that's exactly what this place needs." Before Emily could respond, Victor called for the next round of drills, his voice booming across the gym. "Collins, come up here." Emily walked over to where Victor stood, his expression serious but no longer cold. "You're leading the drill today," he said, his tone devoid of mockery. "Show them how it's done." It was a subtle shift, but it was significant. Victor had never allowed a student, especially not a newcomer, to take charge in this way. Emily had come to the gym expecting to prove herself in the traditional sense, to fight her way through the ranks, but this was different. This was about staging. The drill was simple, a sequence of escapes from dominant positions. Emily partnered with Jason, who had now become more cooperative than competitive. As they moved through the drill, Emily kept the pace steady, focusing on the key details of each technique. She emphasized leverage, control, and patience, the core principles her grandfather had instilled in her. Jason, for the first time, seemed to really listen. "That's smooth," he said as Emily demonstrated an escape from side control, his voice full of newfound respect. By the end of the class, Victor nodded approvingly. "Good work, Collins. Everyone, remember what you've seen today. Jiu-Jitsu is about technique, not just brute strength. Keep practicing." Emily didn't let the compliment go to her head. She knew that one good day of instruction wouldn't undo years of ingrained attitudes. But it was progress, real progress, and the students were beginning to see it. As the OK class disbanded and Emily gathered her things, Dina approached her again. This time, there was something more in her eyes, something like respect or perhaps even admiration. "You were right," Dina said quietly. "I've been here for years, but it's different now. I'm starting to feel like I belong." Emily smiled, her heart swelling with quiet pride. "We all belong here, Dina. We just need to remind them." The gym had changed in small, subtle ways, and Emily knew that it would take time for the shift to become permanent. Victor was still adjusting to the idea of a more inclusive approach, but for the first time, he wasn't just teaching students how to fight. He was teaching them how to grow. Later that evening, after the gym had emptied, Emily sat alone on one of the mats, reflecting on the day's events. She thought about her grandfather, about how he would have approached this moment. He had always believed that change could be quiet, that it didn't have to come with loud declarations. His philosophy had always been about leading by example, about staying true to what was right, even when the world around you told you to stop. Her phone buzzed in her bag, and she picked it up to see a message from Sarah. "I've got the footage. This is going to make a real difference." Emily smiled, her heart light. The video evidence of the day's training session would be part of the presentation she had been working on, focusing on inclusivity in combat sports. It was more than just a document now. It was becoming a movement. The work wasn't over. There would still be resistance, still more challenges to face. But Emily felt the winds of change beginning to stir. And this time, she wasn't just a participant in the fight. She was leading it. Tomorrow she would continue to push forward, not with force or anger, but with the quiet confidence that comes from knowing she was right. The following week felt like a slow unraveling of the old, rigid ways that had defined the Viking Fight Academy for so long. Emily noticed it in the subtle shifts. The way Victor now gave more attention to technique during class, or how the other students who once viewed her with suspicion were starting to ask questions, seeking advice on moves and positions. It was far from a complete transformation, but it was a start. One afternoon, Victor pulled Emily aside after class. She had expected it to be a continuation of their quiet, unspoken understanding, but this time, his tone was more serious than before. "Collins, I've been thinking," Victor began, his arms folded across his chest, his gaze measuring. "I've been doing this a long time, and I'll admit, maybe I've lost sight of what this sport is really about." Emily stayed silent, waiting for him to continue. She had expected resistance, but this was something different. Victor's words were slow, deliberate. He seemed torn between his ego and the nagging realization that his methods might not be the best anymore. "There's been a lot of pushback, from you, from the others, and frankly, I've been too focused on making champions rather than better people," Victor said, his voice lowering. "I want to change the culture here, but I don't know where to start." Emily nodded, offering a soft smile. This was the opening she had been waiting for. "Start with your approach. Change the focus. Jiu-Jitsu isn't about breaking people down, it's about building them up, helping them become the best versions of themselves, both on and off the mat." Victor took a deep breath and ran his hand through his hair, frustration crossing his face. "I know what you mean, but it's hard. The pressure, the competition, it's in the DNA of this place. It's all about survival." Emily stepped forward, her voice steady. "Survival is important, but so is respect. You're not just teaching people how to fight. You're teaching them how to live, how to handle adversity, how to be humble. You've got to create a space where everyone can grow. Not just the strong, not just the winners." For the first time, Victor didn't interrupt her. His shoulders sagged slightly as he absorbed her words. "We'll start with one thing," he said, his eyes finally meeting hers. "I'll change how we train the new students. Less emphasis on winning, more on growth. We'll focus on the fundamentals and respect." Emily could tell that he wasn't just speaking out of obligation. There was a shift, a real one. Victor was ready to change. But the question was, would the others follow? As the days passed, Emily's suspicions were confirmed. Victor's change in approach wasn't as simple as it seemed. The older students were resistant to the idea. Many of them had been trained under Victor's old methods and believed in the supremacy of physical strength and dominance. There was a tangible discomfort in the gym during the next few training sessions. It wasn't obvious, but Emily could sense the tension, the reluctance to let go of old habits. One day, Emily partnered with Dina for a drill. Dina had been more open-minded than most, but even she was showing signs of frustration with the shift. "You see what I mean?" Dina said as they practiced a technique. "It's not that I don't get it, but this way is harder. It's like we're taking a step backward. I don't know if I'm okay with this whole growth over power thing. It feels like we're letting weaker people get away with sloppy technique." Emily exhaled, making an adjustment in Dina's posture. "We're not letting anyone get away with anything," she said, her voice calm but firm. "We're teaching them how to get better, even when they're not the strongest. You've been here long enough to know that power isn't everything. Technique, control, and respect, that's the real strength." Dina sighed but didn't argue. Emily could see that, deep down, she understood. It wasn't about letting people slide. It was about nurturing them, making them realize their potential rather than punishing them for their mistakes. By the end of that session, Dina was still uncertain, but had clearly softened. The seed had been planted. The next day, Victor called Emily into his office. It was clear that the tension in the gym was beginning to affect him too. "I don't know if it's working, Collins," he said, rubbing his temples. "The students aren't buying it. They're questioning everything." Emily leaned against the doorframe, her arms crossed. "It's not going to happen overnight. Change never does. But you're doing the right thing. People will come around. They just need time." Victor let out a heavy breath, looking at her, with a mix of frustration and reluctant respect. "I hope you're right, I really do." She smiled softly. I know I am. Later that evening, as the gym slowly emptied, Emily stayed behind to practice, working through the movements she had learned over the years. The gym, once a place of tension and ego, now felt like a space of quiet contemplation. She could still sense the resistance, but she could also feel the shift. The walls were crumbling just a little bit, and that was enough. As she moved through the drills, Emily's thoughts wandered back to her grandfather. He had always told her that Jiu-Jitsu wasn't just a martial art. It was a philosophy, a way of living. And now she was bringing that philosophy to life. She wasn't just changing Viking Fight Academy. She was changing the hearts and minds of everyone who walked through its doors. And that was only the beginning. The gym had never felt more alive than it did now, but Emily knew the battle was far from won. The atmosphere had shifted, yes, but old habits died hard. Every day brought new challenges. Some students were warming to the idea of the change Victor had started to implement, but others, the more traditional ones, were skeptical. They didn't want to embrace the softer, more inclusive approach that Victor had promised. One evening, as Emily walked into the gym, she could already feel the tension. It wasn't just in the air. It was in the way people moved, in the way they avoided eye contact or exchanged knowing glances. Victor had started assigning students to new partners, mixing the old guard with the newer students, those who had begun to buy into the idea of respect over brute strength. Today, Emily was paired with Keith, a muscular brown belt who had once been a vocal supporter of Victor's no-holds-barred philosophy. He wasn't happy about the changes, but he had no choice but to go along with them, for now. Ready? For another round of this growth crap? Keith's voice was low, mocking as they approached the center of the mat. Emily looked up at him, meeting his gaze evenly. We're here to train, Keith, not to fight about how we train. He grunted but didn't argue further. The students were beginning to see the divide, those who wanted to prove their dominance on the mats, and those who simply wanted to be better, not just stronger. As the class started, Emily focused on the technique they were practicing, a guard sweep into a submission. She moved smoothly, her body flowing with the rhythm of the drill. Keith, on the other hand, was clearly frustrated. He moved with more force than necessary, his body rigid, trying to overpower Emily rather than working with the technique. Relax, Emily said, her voice calm. You're not supposed to muscle through it. Jiu-Jitsu is about control, not strength. Keith's face flushed with annoyance. I know how to do this, Collins, he snapped, trying to break her guard with sheer force. But Emily refused to let him win this way. She allowed him to use all his strength, then, just as he overextended, she swept him effortlessly onto his back, locking in a solid submission. She didn't go hard, she didn't need to. She just used the movement, the leverage, and the patience she had learned over the years. Keith grunted in frustration but didn't tap. He was stubborn, unwilling to acknowledge that he was being outclassed by someone who had trained with a different philosophy. That's it, Emily said, letting the hold go but staying close. Control, not force. You have the strength, Keith. Now you need to learn how to use it properly. Keith didn't reply immediately. He stood up and adjusted his GI, but his jaw was set in a hard line. He was proud, and he hated to admit that someone had shown him something new, something better. The class continued, but Emily noticed a few others watching. They were paying attention more than they had in the past. Maybe they were starting to see what Victor had missed for so long, that the point of jiu-jitsu wasn't to crush your opponent, but to flow with them, to outthink them, to make them feel like they never had a chance. At the end of class, Victor called for another break, and the students scattered around the gym, some chatting quietly, others stretching. Emily stayed where she was, sitting on the mat with her water bottle in hand. She hadn't expected this shift to be easy, but she hadn't anticipated how deep the resistance would run. The culture Victor had built here for so long wasn't just about fighting. It was about ego, dominance, and showing off. And that was the hardest thing to change. Victor approached Emily, his face a little more relaxed than usual. but there was something in his eyes that suggested he still wasn't fully at ease with the changes. "You're doing good work here, Collins," he said quietly. "But I can see it. The students aren't all in. Some of them are still holding on to the old ways." Emily nodded, understanding what he meant. "It takes time, Victor. Change doesn't happen overnight, especially when you've spent years telling people that power is the only thing that matters." Victor ran a hand through his hair, looking out across the room. "I know, but I don't want to lose them." "You won't," Emily said. "It's just about helping them understand that there's more than one way to be strong." Victor didn't respond immediately, but he didn't dismiss her either. For the first time since Emily had stepped foot in the academy, he seemed genuinely thoughtful. "I want to keep the academy strong, Emily," he said, his voice low. "But I don't want it to be a place that breaks people down anymore. I want it to be a place that builds them up." "That's exactly what it can be," Emily said, her voice steady. "It's not about being the toughest fighter in the room. It's about being the most skilled, the most composed, the most respectful. And you've already started to show them that." Victor looked at her, his eyes softer than they had been before. "Maybe you're right." Emily smiled slightly. "I know I am." As the gym began to clear out, Emily walked toward the door. The students were leaving with a different energy than they had the day before, some exchanging quiet words with each other, others simply reflecting on the lesson. It was subtle, but it was there, a shift in the air, a promise that change was coming even if it took time. Out of the corner of her eye, she caught Dina watching her from across the room. She gave Emily a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of the change that had begun, of the way things were starting to feel more inclusive. It wasn't perfect yet, but it was enough. The foundation was being laid, and Emily knew, deep down, that it was only a matter of time before the academy would truly reflect the values her grandfather had taught her. And Victor Johansson, whether he fully realized it or not, was now a part of that change. The weeks that followed were a mixture of progress and setbacks. Emily could feel the change she had started at Viking Fight Academy, but it wasn't a smooth path. Victor was still struggling with fully embracing the shift, and the students, though quieter in their resistance, were not yet fully on board with the new vision of Jiu-Jitsu. The academy's old guard, those who thrived under Victor's harsh, competitive approach, were still clinging to the idea that dominance was everything, but Emily was persistent. She knew that change wasn't about making everyone comfortable. It was about making them think, making them question what they had always assumed to be true. Today was different, though. Today, the gym felt unusually tense. Victor had announced that the academy would be hosting a regional jiu-jitsu competition next month, and every student was expected to participate in the trials. It wasn't just about competing. It was about proving their worth, their place in the hierarchy that Victor had worked so hard to build. It was a test of strength, not just in jiu-jitsu, but in ego. As Emily laced up her GI, she could feel the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. She hadn't competed in years. Her focus had always been on the purity of the art, on teaching, on improving, on sharing the lessons her grandfather had passed down to her. But here, in this environment, it seemed like competing was the ultimate measure of your skill, and Emily wasn't sure she was ready to buy into that mentality. Her partner for the day was Keith again. He was still struggling with the shift in training philosophy, and she could see the skepticism in his eyes. His pride had been wounded by their last sparring match, and now it seemed like he was waiting for the perfect opportunity to prove himself. Emily wasn't concerned. She knew what she had to do. She wasn't here to crush anyone's ego. She was here to help everyone understand what jiu-jitsu really meant. "Collins," Keith said as they squared off on the mat, his tone a little sharper than usual. "You better be ready today. Victor's not gonna let anyone slide." "I'm always ready, Keith," Emily replied, her voice calm but firm. "But I'm not here to impress Victor. I'm here to teach you." Keith narrowed his eyes but didn't respond. They began the drill. working through the sequences with controlled aggression. Emily was fast, precise, and calculated, her movements flowing like water. Keith, on the other hand, was tense, trying to overpower her with sheer force. She allowed him to use his strength, but every time he overcommitted, she used it to her advantage. As they continued through the drill, Victor watched from across the room, his eyes narrowing as he observed the interaction. Emily could feel his gaze on her, was calculating, measuring her every move. There was something different about the way he was watching her now. It wasn't judgmental or dismissive. It was thoughtful. "You're holding back," Keith said, gritting his teeth as he tried to push Emily into a submission. "I'm not holding back," Emily replied evenly, adjusting her position. "I'm showing you how to move, not just how to fight. You'll understand eventually." Keith didn't look convinced, but his movements started to slow down as he began to understand the rhythm of the drill. He was still trying to prove something, but Emily could see the shift in his thinking. For the first time, he wasn't relying on his raw power. He was listening to her, to the flow of the movement, and that was what Jiu-Jitsu was all about. As the class moved into free sparring, Emily's mind remained focused. She had seen the progress in the gym, the small shifts in attitude, the quieter respect from her fellow students. But there was still so much more work to be done. Victor's methods were evolving, but so was the academy's culture. It was clear to Emily now that this wasn't just about her changing Victor's perspective. It was about changing the way the entire academy viewed Jiu-Jitsu. The first round of sparring began. Emily was paired with Jason, the young black belt, who had once underestimated her. They squared off, and for a moment Emily could see the doubt in his eyes. He remembered what had happened the last time they fought, but this time things were different. Jason's approach was more calculated, less aggressive, and there was a newfound respect in his movements. They flowed together on the mat, exchanging techniques, not in an attempt to outpower each other, but to outthink each other. Victor watched from the sidelines, his arms crossed. His eyes flicked between the sparring pairs, his lips tight in concentration. Emily knew he was observing the shift. He was starting to see that it wasn't about power or brute strength. It was about technique, patience, and control. At the end of the sparring session, Victor called for a break. Emily wiped the sweat from her brow, but she didn't feel exhausted. She felt energized. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was exactly where she needed to be. As the students gathered around, Victor approached her. There was a flicker of something new in his eyes, something softer. "You're doing good work here, Collins," Victor said, his voice quieter than usual. "I see it. The way you approach this art, it's different, but it's working." Emily smiled slightly, but she didn't let the compliment go to her head. "It's not about me, Victor. It's about all of us. We're building something better here." Victor nodded, looking over the students as they gathered around, ready to begin the next round. "Maybe you're right," he said, his voice thoughtful. "Maybe it's time we focus on that." As the gym slowly emptied, Emily felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. The work wasn't done, but every day the walls of resistance were crumbling. A little more. She wasn't just changing Victor's perspective. She was changing the academy, one student at a time. And though the path was still long, Emily knew one thing for sure. This fight was worth it. It had been months since Emily first walked through the doors of Viking Fight Academy, and in that time, she had seen changes ripple through the gym. Not just in the training methods, but in the way people moved, the way they looked at each other, and the way they looked at themselves. There was still resistance, still a few holdouts who clung to the old ways, but Emily could feel the shift. It was undeniable. Today, however, felt different. Today, the Academy was hosting a special seminar, one that Emily had been asked to lead. Victor had suggested it, though at first he had been hesitant. He had never seen himself as the type to invite someone else to take the lead. But Emily had proved herself, not just with her skills, but with her philosophy, and Victor had finally come around. This seminar wasn't just about Jiu-Jitsu techniques. It was about the spirit of Jiu-Jitsu, the philosophy, and the respect that Emily had been fighting for from the very beginning. The gym was packed, with students lined up on the mats waiting for the seminar to begin. Victor stood at the front, watching quietly, his arms crossed. His presence wasn't as imposing as it once was. He was still Victor, still the head coach, but there was something more subdued in the way he held himself now, something more thoughtful. He had changed. Emily stepped to the center of the room, taking a deep breath. This was her moment, not just to demonstrate technique, but to show everyone, including Victor, what Jiu-Jitsu could truly be. She wasn't here to show off her own skills. She was here to show them the path her grandfather had laid out, a path of growth, respect, and humility. "Welcome, everyone," she began, her voice calm but firm, echoing through the room. "Today, we're going to talk about Jiu-Jitsu, not just as a sport, but as a way of life. It's more than just what happens on the mat. It's about how we treat each other, how we grow together, and how we learn from our failures as much as our successes." There was a murmur in the crowd, some of the students looking at each other, unsure of what to expect. But Emily wasn't here to be gentle. She was here to challenge them. "Jiu-Jitsu is a reflection of life," Emily continued, pacing slowly across the mat. "It's not about domination. It's about balance, about being able to control yourself as much as your opponent. It's about respect, for your training partners, for the art, and for yourself." As she spoke, she noticed Victor in the back, his gaze fixed on her. There was no mockery, no arrogance in his eyes. There was only something that looked like acknowledgement, a small nod of approval. "We're going to start with a drill," Emily said, snapping back to the present. "But this time, I want you to think beyond the moves. Think about the purpose behind them. Why do we perform a sweep? Why do we transition so smoothly? It's not about showing off. It's about creating a flow, understanding the essence of the move. You don't make jiu-jitsu work. You let it work." She paired the students off and began walking around, offering subtle corrections, guiding them to focus less on brute force and more on precision. Every so often she glanced at Victor. He was still watching, but his expression had changed. Where there had once been skepticism, now there was respect. Genuine respect. As the drill progressed, Emily noticed something different in the students. The tension, the competitiveness that had once filled the gym was gone. Instead, there was a quiet focus, a shared understanding that had never been present before. Even Keith, the one student who had been the most resistant to change, was now moving with purpose, his movements more deliberate and controlled. And at the end of the session, Victor called the class to a halt. The gym was still, save for the sound of slow breathing and the soft shuffle of feet. Everyone was waiting for Victor to speak, wondering how he would respond to the seminar. He stepped forward, looking out at the students, his gaze sweeping across the room. "I have to admit," Victor began, his voice surprisingly steady, "I've been wrong. All these years I thought that jiu-jitsu was about producing champions. But it's more than that. It's about making people better. Better fighters, yes, but better people too." The room fell silent. It was the first time Victor had openly admitted his mistakes in front of the class. Emily stood still, not wanting to interrupt, but feeling a quiet sense of pride swell in her chest. "I've watched Collins show you all something today that I couldn't," Victor continued, his eyes flicking briefly to Emily. "She's reminded us all that jiu-jitsu is about respect, for each other, for the art, and for ourselves." The students exchanged glances, some nodding, some still processing. But there was a shift in the air. Something had changed in Victor, and in the way the students now saw each other. Emily knew it wouldn't be instant, but it was a start. "As of today," Victor said, his voice firm, "we're making some changes here. The focus won't be just on winning. It will be on growing. It will be about technique, respect, and above all, humility." The gym erupted into murmurs. Emily could see the surprise in their faces, but she also saw the spark of hope, of understanding, starting to flicker. Victor's words had weight, and this time they were words of growth, not domination. As the seminar concluded, Emily felt a sense of quiet triumph. This wasn't just a victory for her. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been overlooked, underestimated, or silenced. This was the victory her grandfather had wanted, and it was happening, right here, right now. She looked at Victor, who met her gaze with a small but genuine nod. "Thank you, Emily," he said simply, the words carrying more weight than anything he had ever said to her before. Emily smiled, her heart full. "We're just getting started." As the students left the gym that day, there was a lightness in their steps. They weren't just leaving with new techniques. They were leaving with a new mindset, one that would shape their approach to jiu-jitsu, and maybe even to life itself. Emily had fought not just for respect in the academy, but for a shift in the very culture of the sport. And that, she realized, was the true victory.